It's very easy to define doom metal. Heavy and slow, distorted guitars, and a wall of sound with a very strong bass sound. Low tempos, which can sometimes increase, minor scales, and tritone bass dissonance. Compared to other metal genres, there's a clearer connection to what we might call classic rock in both structure and sound. I'm talking about the proto-metal, pre-Sad Wings of Destiny era. Also, in some of the subgenres, there's a direct connection to heavy psychedelia, or even plain psychedelia from the late 60s. The vocals, at least in the genre's original form, are clear and delivered in a way that expresses despair, desperation, or pain, mimicking the high-pitched screams of Ozzy Osbourne or Bobby Liebling of Pentagram. Later, when the subgenres started, we had both death metal growls and operatic lyricism. Now, over music like this and with vocals of this kind, you obviously can't write lyrics about love and flowers. So, the lyrics are almost always dark and pessimistic, and they cover themes such as pain, depression, fear, sorrow, terror, death, and anger. Some bands write lyrics in an introspective and personal way, while others convey their themes using symbolism, which can be inspired by occultism or literature. Some doom metal bands use religious imagery in their music. As is well known, Trouble were among the first to incorporate Christian iconography, while many others spoke of occultism, paganism, and Satanism. When the Offshoots began, the themes were influenced by the style mixed with doom metal. For example, stoner or psych doom bands often describe hallucinogenic or psychedelic experiences, while epic doom bands have lyrics from the realm of fantasy and mythology. Of course, the primary origin of the genre is the sound of Black Sabbath in the first half of the 1970s, and secondarily, that of Pentagram from the same decade. The reason I put the Americans a bit behind the English isn't sound-related, as Bobby Liebling's band is even more consistently doom metal than Tony Iommi's, which experimented with other things from time to time. The problem, however, is that in the 1970s, Pentagram only released 4 hard-to-find 7-inch singles and 1 regular single under the name Macabre. Their first album wasn't released until 1985, so their influence can't be on the same level as that of Sabbath, one of the biggest names in heavy rock at the time, with millions of sales worldwide. In fact, Bobby Liebling himself hates the term doom metal and says his band plays heavy hard rock. A special mention should also be made of a side project by Pentagram guitarist Randy Palmer, which featured the band's drummer Jeff O'Keefe and Liebling himself, called Beiginnings, who were active in their first incarnation from 1973 to 1979. They sounded even heavier than Pentagram, but they didn't release anything official until some bootleg recordings of their songs from the 70s were made available in 1999. The first authorized release of their old tracks will only come out in 2005. Now, besides the 2 main protagonists, there are a number of bands that, mainly in the late 60s and early 70s, played things that could be called proto-doom. For example, I can mention the great Californian band Blue Cheer and their classic 1968 debut album, Vinspus Eruptum, the Japanese flower traveling band with their awesome 1971 album, Satori, the terrifying Icelandic band Icecross, who, on their only release of 1973, seemed to anticipate 3 or 4 metal genres, including doom, of course, and finally the occult legends from Essex, Zior, who with their 1973 song Entrance of the Devil seemed to be at least 10 years ahead of their time. practically speaking, if you look at the songs from most proto-metal bands, you'll find proto-doom tracks in there. So initially, I'll refer you to the two videos I've made about this topic. Besides the bands I mentioned in the two videos, I can also talk about Toe Fat, featuring Ken Hensley and Lee Kerslake of Uriah Heep, the awesome Scottish band Iron Claw, who, like Pentagram, never released anything official during their existence, and we only know them from archival releases. The somewhat more progressive German band Night Sun, with their excellent 1972 album Mornin', or even Dark from Northampton, with their deafeningly distorted round the edges from the same year. Never gonna miss your miss, fine look. Never ever walk away. Now, because we've said it before and we'll say it again, there will always be those who claim the Beatles played everything first. Their track, I Want You, She's So Heavy, from the 1969 album Abbey Road, is often referred to as proto-doom. Now, since the idea of using heavily distorted guitars, slow tempos, long song durations, and occult lyrics predated Black Sabbath and was considered a notable experiment in the underground psychedelic scene of the time, we have proto-doom tracks from sources we would never have expected. Listen, for example, to how various garage/heavy psych bands built the wall of sound of doom long before the bands of the 80s did. Or how various purely psychedelic bands decide to delve deep into that sound for just one track before returning back to psychedelia. Moving a bit closer to straight rock territory now, see how heavy blues transforms into proto-doom through the sounds of the great Rory Gallagher and his band Taste, the formidable Argentinian guitarist Norberto Papo Napolitano, or the primitive English bluesman Stackwaddy. But there are even stranger cases. For example, the German band Guru Guru gave us a debut in 1970 titled UFO, which is essentially 36 minutes of distorted guitar, LSD-soaked atmosphere, and a proto-doom sound. Of course, due to their origin, they were categorized as krautrock. Finally, the strangest case of all is a fully experimental band from New York called Cro-Magnon, who in 1973 released an album recorded in 1969, with which they were trying to predict the music of 1979. The album is very challenging to listen to, but its first track is this. In the end, they probably didn't predict the sound of 1979, but rather that of 1985 or 1992. Personally, I believe that doom metal took its first steps within the framework of the new wave of British heavy metal. Several bands in this genre were not inspired by Judas Priest only, but also looked towards Sabbath. Among these, we must highlight two names: First up, Pagan Altar from the outskirts of London. They were formed in 1978. It was the idea of singer Terry Jones and his guitarist son Alan. The two spent 5 years perfecting their musical vision, accumulating plenty of unreleased demo material at their headquarters, called Pagan Studios in Brockley, South London. Their rhythm section was constantly changing, which made it difficult for them to release anything out there. Finally, in 1982, they independently released their self-titled debut album, which was essentially a 40-minute demo containing heavy, Sabbath-esque, occult heavy metal infused with a gothic folk horror atmosphere, presenting a much more terrifying perspective than their closest contemporaries in the new wave of British heavy metal circle. Despite this, record labels showed no interest. By 1983, the new wave of British heavy metal had declined and occultism was completely out of fashion. So the band broke up in 1985, only to reform in 2004 and release a series of albums, the latest of which came out this year. The second band was Witchfinder General, who were formed in 1979 in Stourbridge, a suburb of Birmingham. They were named after the eponymous 1968 British horror film, which was based on the notorious witch hunter Matthew Hopkins. They released their first album, titled Death Penalty, in September 1982. Their sound wasn't that scary, nor could it be called doom metal on all the tracks. Also, their subject matter was much less extreme than that of Pagan Altar. They talked about more classic rock themes, sex, drugs, etc. However, we must mention them. Firstly, because their sound is doom metal in a lot of songs, and secondly, because they were heard by many more people after having their album released by a regular label and not themselves. Of course, the truth is that what impressed the audience the most at that time was, as you can easily understand, the album cover. A year after their debut, they will release their second album, Friends of Hell, which essentially is nothing more than a new version of Death Penalty. The overall decline of the new wave of British heavy metal, along with the controversy caused by their album covers, would lead to the band's breakup in 1984. They returned in 2006, but ultimately disbanded for good in 2008 after one more album. After this sort of introduction, it's time to talk about the top 3 bands of the genre. Those who are considered to have made it known in the metal scene and are perhaps its most characteristic representatives. St. Vitus was formed in 1978 under the name Tyrant in sunny Los Angeles, led by guitarist Dave Chandler and later by singer Scott Riegers. They changed their name to St. Vitus in 1980 after the Black Sabbath song St. Vitus Dance. The band's early sound combined the dark and psychedelic style of bands like Black Sabbath and Blue Cheer with the aggressive heavy metal of Judas Priest and the hardcore sound of Black Flag, another of Chandler's favorite bands. In the beginning, their style was considered outdated compared to the heavy rock genres that were popular at the time. Completely excluded from the then Los Angeles metal scene, they would receive unexpected help from Black Flag themselves, whose guitarist Greg Ginn signed them to his label, SST Records. There, St. Vitus recorded 2 albums, St. Vitus and Hallows Victim, and 1 EP, The Walking Dead. The singer left the band in early 1986 and was replaced by the Obsessed frontman, Scott Wino Weinrich. The Obsessed were sonically very close to Vitus, but until then, they had only released 1 7-inch single. The band's first album with Wino on vocals, 1986's Born Too Late, became their most recognized album, and the title track is considered one of the anthems of the doom metal genre. They talk about my length of hair. The Wino years marked a change in their style, with an even slower and darker sound, in contrast to the hardcore influences of their first two albums, while simultaneously, the band began to gain some fame in Europe. Weinrich left the band in 1991 to reform The Obsessed, while the band continues to this day, having released a series of albums, most of which are of very good quality. Their dirty, rock-influenced style, as well as their initial hardcore references, have made them a major influence on the stoner and sludge doom metal subgenres. Guitarist Rick Wartell formed Trouble in 1978 in Chicago during his school years. After placing an ad at the Illinois Entertainer in 1981, he found second guitarist Bruce Franklin and singer Eric Wagner, who would accompany him as an integral part of the original version of the band for the next 16 years. Drawing inspiration from Black Sabbath, the band used down-tuned guitars, creating a classic doom metal sound. But that wasn't initially what they would become known for. The lyrics of the Catholic Wagner were often openly inspired by the Bible, which led their label, Metal Blade, to promote them as a white metal band in contrast to their satanic black metal counterparts, which, as we recall, at that time was a term that included all intensely satanic bands, regardless of what they played. Wagner has hinted that Metal Blade was the one who insisted on the term in the first place, while the band had rejected it. Trouble's first three albums, Psalm 9, 1984, The Skull, 1985, and Run to the Light, 1987, are excellent examples of pure, traditional doom metal at its finest. The band is right in the middle. They're not as dirty and proto-metallic as St. Vitus, nor as epic as Candlemass. They are practically the archetype of what was later called traditional doom metal. A 3-year hiatus followed before the band signed with Rick Rubin's Def American Records. The notorious producer wanted to do for the Chicago band what he did for Danzig and The Cult: cut away the fat from their sound, strip it down, make it drier and more accessible to a wider audience. The two albums Trouble recorded for him, the self-titled one of 1990 and Manic Frustration of 1992, are indeed closer to old-school rock, so to speak, while the second one also has very strong influences from the Beatles and psychedelia, but essentially they remain extremely heavy and traditional. So they didn't achieve the success Rubin expected, and their adventure with Def American would end in 1993. The band then released Plastic Greenhead on Music for Nations in 1995, maintaining the sound of the Rubin era. They later disbanded, reunited, released an album in 2008, and another in 2013. They are considered by many to be one of the most underrated bands in the history of heavy rock. After the dissolution of his first band, Nemesis, bassist Leif Edling formed Candlemass in Stockholm, Sweden in 1984. Along with guitarist Mats Mappa Björkman and drummer Mats Ekström, they recruited session singer Johan Lenkvist and released their first album, Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, on June 10, 1986. We're talking about a huge album in every way you can imagine. For most of us, since it was very difficult to find St. Vitus or Trouble records in Greece back then, it was our first contact with the doom metal genre. It was truly something completely different, something that left you speechless when you heard it. Soon, the band also found a permanent singer, the monk, Messiah Marklin. With Jan Lin as the new drummer and Lars Johansson as an additional lead guitarist, the band will form its classic lineup and release 3 albums in 3 years: the golden epic Doom trilogy of Nightfall, 1987, Ancient Dreams, 1988, and Tales of Creation, 1989. These first 4 albums by the Swedes are, I think, enough to secure their place in the genre's pantheon. Their sound was much more European compared to anything that had come before. There was an epic quality and an almost operatic lyricism that we didn't find in the more dirty, rock-oriented, or even psychedelic sound of everything I mentioned earlier. The Swedes will form the basis for the epic doom metal subgenre, which will be mentioned later. The band still exists today. In fact, they regularly release albums, and they reunited with Johan Längfist as their permanent singer this time in 2018. It should be mentioned here that because the official debut of Pentagram was released around the same time as that of the Big Three, they are often grouped together, forming what is known as the Big Four of doom metal. Before I close this chapter, I'd like to mention two more specific cases of bands that played something very close to doom metal in the late 70s, but are often overlooked in the genre's history because they never became particularly well known. The first are Sorcery from Chicago, a band so obscure they don't even have a Wikipedia page. They existed as a group from 1976 until around 1980, and you shouldn't confuse them with the similarly named hard rock band from California, which gained greater fame around the same time. Over these years, two albums were released. What interests us is their debut album, Sinister Soldiers, which came out in 1978, making the rather bold move for a debut album to release it as a double LP. This is a work that connects the past with the future in such a way that when it came out, it seemed completely out of place and was completely ignored. We're talking about heavy rock that combines the heavy psychedelia and early 70s Sabbath with the still new at the time classic heavy metal sound. Even the cover looks like a US power metal album from 1983. After many, many years, they will be rediscovered too. So the album has been re-released in a remastered version. The second band is Death SS from Italy, a band actually very well known in Greece. They've been around since 1977, but they released their first album in 1988. They have the occultism, Satanism, horror theme fully covered in all aspects of their music. In fact, they were perhaps the first band to take these themes so seriously, long before Bathory, Venom, Merciful Fate, or later the black metal bands from Norway. What primarily interests us in this story was what they did at the beginning of their career, for which there are two official releases. The 1983 EP Evil Metal, in which the iconic figure and leader of the band, Steve Sylvester, does not participate, and the 1987 compilation The Story of Death SS, 1977-1984. I believe that if the band had a more neutral image and managed to release an album with wider distribution back then, the history of doom metal would have been written completely differently. Their albums were never released globally by a major metal label, so they remained essentially a cult phenomenon, with a small but devoted following. However, to the surprise of many, their fame has grown in recent years, after Tobias Forge, the leader of Ghost, named them as one of his all-time favorite bands. The truth is that even during the golden age of heavy metal, pure doom metal as a genre didn't give us so many names. Besides the big three or four, back in the early 90s, we had The Obsessed, of course, the Swedish Count Raven and Stillborn, the latter with some gothic influences in their early days, the Americans' Revelation, and the English former Thrashers' Sacrilege, surprising everyone with a typical doom album. However, the biggest impression was made by the new band of former Napalm Death singer Lee Dorian, called Cathedral, which was advertised as the slowest band in the universe, fronted by the former singer of the fastest band in the universe, which was not very far from the truth. In the end, developments overtook doom metal, with the changing musical climate in England and America in 1992. But they did something else too, in a particularly impressive way, I would say. They favored the growth of various subgenres or branches, if you will, of the original pure style. I would even say that doom metal is perhaps the only genre in all of heavy metal that has more artists in its offshoots than in the original sound. But let's take it all step by step. We're starting with epic doom metal. Here the name speaks for itself. We have doom metal with a clear influence from classic traditional heavy metal, without any old rock or psych deviations, with a strong theatricality and lyricism, and themes taken from fantasy and mythology. The founders of the genre are certainly Candlemass, but the undisputed leaders are the American band Solitude Aeternus from Dallas, Texas. They've never released a bad album, while their first three and their latest to date, 2006's Alone, are the alpha and omega of the genre. A genre that, without ever achieving great success, has consistently provided us with new names to this day. Bands like the Russians' Scald, the British Solstice, the Italians' Doom Sword, the Germans' Doomshine, the Americans' While Heaven Wept, the Swedish Isol, and two more recent names, the Americans' Crypt Sermon and the Danish Altar of Oblivion. If you think some names are missing, wait until the end, because there are many overlaps with other offshoots. Let's move on to the two most extreme branches, which I'm mentioning together because they have a clear musical kinship. They are death doom metal and funeral doom metal. The first takes the genre's characteristic sound and infuses it with elements from death metal, such as growling vocals and double bass drumming, while the second is an even slower, drawn-out, and desperate version of the original doom metal sound, with steadily developing patterns reminiscent of elegies or laments. Both genres are clearly heavier and more suffocating compared to doom's original musical proposal, to the point that they are consistently included in the extreme metal branches. For those who have listened to them, I know they sound very similar. So what are their differences, if they have any? I would say that funeral doom metal tends to have very long song durations, a less aggressive drum sound, sparse vocals, and a sound that steadily rises or falls without sudden tempo changes. In death doom metal, the song structures are more traditional, the durations are shorter, and there's a tendency for the slow pace to occasionally break and transition into mid-tempo passages. These are some general observations that should be treated with caution, since the two genres are very similar. Death doom is considered to have started with a series of bands that I will mention first, because they were very successful in the metal scene at the time, and they all have the characteristic that they later changed their musical style, sometimes radically. These are three very well-known and beloved bands from England. Paradise Lost, who released what is considered the first album of the genre in 1990. My Dying Bride, and Anathema, as well as the Swedish band Tiamat in their first two albums. They will all have very important careers, while those who stayed closest to the traditional sound of the genre are My Dying Bride. As the decade progressed, we will find other bands that, starting from this sound, would change their style and have successful careers as a part of something else. Characteristic examples are the Swedish bands Catatonia and Lake of Tears, the Norwegian band Theatre of Tragedy, the Dutch band The Gathering, and even my compatriots Nightfall. Now, if we want to be more scrupulous, The Dutch band Sempiternal Deathrain beat everyone else by a year with their 1989 album The Spooky Gloom, while the Americans' Winter are very close in the timeline to Paradise Lost with their 1990 album Into Darkness. However, the previous two did not continue their careers after these albums and have been somewhat forgotten in the evolution of the genre. A very special case is the Californian band Autopsy, who, coming from pure death metal, slowed down considerably and gave us the masterful Mental Funeral in 1991, where practically and for only one album, they also entered the history and evolution of the genre, something their Dutch colleagues Asphyx would do with their self-titled album in 1994. In between these two, in 1993, the Australian band Disembowelment gave us one of the absolute masterpieces of the genre, the album Transcendence into the Peripheral, which also features elements of funeral doom metal. Finally, I must mention the formidable German band The Ruins of Beverist, who for about 20 years have masterfully blended death doom metal with atmospheric black metal, giving us a series of albums of exceptional quality. In closing, I will mention some names who have faithfully served and continue to serve the genre over the approximately 35 years since its creation. As for funeral doom metal, it was built as a genre a little later than death doom metal, which clearly shows the influence it had on it, especially the Disembowelment album. Logically, we could consider Finnish band Thurgathon's Stream from the Heavens from 1994 as the starting point of the genre, after which the band did not continue its career. So others took up the baton, with the British band Esoteric, from Birmingham in fact, being the leaders. They practically gave the genre its identity with the incredible albums they released and continue to release, the pinnacle of which is 2008's The Maniacal Veil. From then on, the genre is more closed than its death doom cousin, with the main names in its history being Let's go to the other side now, the rocking side. That's where the number of names rises exponentially. As we already know, the stoner rock and metal genre developed to very high levels of recognition, quality, and success during the 1990s. A mix of early 70s proto-metal with the heavy psychedelia of the same period, electric blues, and space rock from bands like Hawkwind or Gong. Doom metal was a clear, very distinct component of the genre, especially in its metal version, giving us what we could call stoner doom metal. The connection here to Black Sabbath, Pentagram, Blue Cheer, and the entire proto-metal group is clear and passes through St. Vitus and the Obsessed, with Scott Wino Weinrich becoming a kind of leader, godfather, and representative of the whole style. The genre is considered to have originated with the monumental Sleep's Holy Mountain by the eponymous band Sleep from San Jose, California, and finds its most perfect expression in both the Californians and the massive English band Electric Wizard, who are considered to have perfected it in their 2000 album Dope Throne, giving us one of the best records in the entire stoner metal canon. From there, we can talk again about Cathedral, who, after their classic debut album, Forest of Equilibrium, gradually started rocking more and more, transitioning into this style. The Italian band UFO Mamet, who connect the genre with sludge metal and psychedelia, the crazy and very unique Japanese band Church of Misery, as well as all the bands Wino formed over the years, with the Hidden Hand and Spirit Caravan being the most prominent. Beyond those, we have a very large group of bands, from which I can only mention a small portion, based primarily on subjective criteria. I'm saying again that I could put 50 names here. I just don't want the whole video to be a continuous list, so please forgive me for including just a small part. The set of these bands became even larger after the so-called retro proto-metal or retro heavy psych scene became a reality sometime in the 2000s. Many of the members of this style played things close to doom metal too, for the same reasons their stoner counterparts did. I could mention bands like the Canadian Blood Ceremony, especially in their early days, the British Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats, the American Jex Thoth, the awesome Swedish Witchcraft, also in their early days, and one of the biggest contemporary hopes of the heavy rock sound, the Italian Messa. Now I could go even further. For example, there's sludge metal, which practically mixes elements of doom metal with elements of hardcore punk, or even many gothic metal bands like Draconian November, Virgin Black, and especially the biggest name in this style, Type O Negative, are considered to have touched upon doom metal in many of their albums. But if I keep going like this, I'll get boring and stray too far from the source. So, I'll conclude by saying that in recent years, with doom metal branching out into so many subgenres and attracting so many different artists, there was a need to somehow distinguish those who remain consistently close to the genre's original traditional sound. So the term traditional doom metal was invented, which initially sounds like an oxymoron, but it exists for bands that do exactly what I described. Of course, even here there are some deviations that make things even more confusing, but what can we do? As the main exponents of the term, I will mention the formidable Finnish band Reverend Bizarre, who unfortunately disbanded in 2007 after giving us 3 albums of excellent quality. The more modern Americans Pallbearer, the superside project of Candlemass's Leif Edling, Crux, as well as Lucifer, featuring the until recently married couple of Johanna Sedonis and Nikki Anderson of Entombed. I could also mention here, I believe that 2 more of the great hopes of the modern heavy rock sound belong: Spirit Adrift from Arizona, and especially Castle Rat from Brooklyn, New York, who combine their sound with a very strong theatricality capable of attracting a very large audience. Concluding this awesome story, I'll mention one last landmark album that shows how doom metal can touch and inspire everyone in the heavy rock scene. I'm talking about Celtic Frost's Monotheist, which marked the band's impressive return to active duty, and where the great duo of Tom G. Warrior and Martin Eric Ain, after inspiring so many musicians of various extreme genres, give us maybe their best work, immersed in a deep, heavy, and suffocating doom metal maelstrom that destroys everything. It's a shame the band broke up again soon after.